Hey, Pelahatchie. I'm here ready for a midweek Bible study for you. I was inspired by something. I finally got to, this past weekend, to clean out my outside storage space. One of the things that we did when we moved here was all my man stuff, you know, my tools and the kind of things that are mine, usually go in the outside storage, just got shoved out there when we moved in almost a year and a half ago, because it seemed like, you know, the house was more important and that was the priority, and we just shoved it in the storage room, and it's been sitting there. Except for the couple of things I've been able to find and pull out that I needed, it's just been sitting there waiting. And of course, when this whole pandemic thing started and everybody started getting to clean out, I was laid up in my recliner recovering from Achilles tendon surgery, and just had not been able to do those kind of little projects that I know many of us have gotten to do over the last 6 or 8 weeks. Well, finally, this past weekend, I felt well enough, the weather was good, I got to do it. And I'm out there, and I'm pulling stuff out, and it's dirty, and it's nasty, and I'm throwing stuff away, and I'm finding tools that I'd forgotten I had. Guys, you can probably relate to that. It was fun, it was glorious. And while I was doing it, it made me think about this story, obviously from Scripture. When Jesus goes and cleanses the temple, that's the word we use for it. It's a story that shows up in all of the Gospels. All 4 of them say it. John says it differently because he puts it at the beginning of Jesus' ministry. All the rest, all the synoptic Gospels, put it towards the end. So that's what I want us to think about today, and kind of use the inspiration of us cleansing things out and cleaning things out, because I know a lot of us are. I took a load to the little dumpster in town just this morning and saw 4 church members while I was there. It was glorious. It was like this little social reunion. We got to see each other. Some of them I've not seen since we kind of had to close things down a while ago. So I know we're all doing that. We're all in the process of kind of a spring pandemic cleaning. I don't think about what Jesus does in the temple. I'm going to use the version from Mark. In Mark chapter 11 is where I want us to go. So if you would, get your Bibles, follow along with me. It's a longer passage, so we want to be able to read all of it, and then go back through and kind of piece it apart. So Mark chapter 11, we're going to start in verse 11. It says, Jesus entered Jerusalem and went into the temple courts. So this is like his coming into temple. It's kind of like the triumphant entry area. That's the timeline in Jesus' life where we are in Mark's gospel. So he's in the temple courts. He looked around at everything, but since it was already late, he went out to Bethany with the 12, which is where he spent the night. The next day, as they were leaving Bethany, Jesus was hungry. Seeing in the distance a fig tree and leaf, he went to find out if it had any fruit. When he reached it, he found nothing but leaves, because it was not the season for figs. Then he said to the tree, "May no one ever eat fruit from you again." And his disciples heard him say it. On reaching Jerusalem, Jesus entered the temple courts and began driving out those who were buying and selling there. He overturned the tables of the money changers and the benches of those selling doves, and would not allow anyone to carry merchandise through the temple courts. And as he taught them, he said, "Is it not written, 'My house will be called a house of prayer for all nations,' but you have made it a den of robbers"? Well, the chief priests and the teachers of the law heard this and began looking for a way to kill him, for they feared him, because the whole crowd was amazed at his teaching. So when evening came, Jesus and his disciples went back out of the city. In the morning, as they went along, they saw the fig tree withering from the roots. And Peter remembered and said to Jesus, "Rabbi, look, the fig tree that you cursed has withered." So this is Jesus' cleansing the temple story. The traditional thought when you hear this story, when you first think about it, is Jesus is cleansing it because it's become corrupt, because it's sinful, and that's obviously easy for us to see on the backside of the story. And that's true. Like, that's exactly what is happening. But I think there's actually more to it than that, especially the way that Mark tells the story, the way he frames it with this fig tree idea, is that it's more than just corruption that's present in the temple and Jesus cleansing it out. There's deeper level of truth here. So I want to think about some things that we see. Like, the first thing that we pick up in this story is Jesus, he sees obviously the temple and the fig tree, and they appear to be thriving. All right, that's kind of the idea. It's where we start in verse 11. Is you see Jesus goes into Jerusalem, he goes into the temple courts, he looks around at everything, but it was kind of late and he decides to go home. And everything at the temple seems to be thriving. You think about what it is that Jesus would have seen when he went in there. So he would have gone into at least the outer court, which is the Gentile courts. Jesus may have gone farther in, but it doesn't seem like it. In those outer courts is where the money changers are. And what they're doing is truth is, they're doing necessary tasks. You had to have this certain type of Tyrenian shekel, and that's how you would pay your temple tax and do the business at the temple. Of course, no one used that anymore. Everyone used the Roman coins. So there were money exchangers out there that were swapping those, and of course, they're making money on that. They're exchanging and getting a rate from it. So there's these exchange tables for money. There's also exchange tables for unclean animals, because you could bring animals with you, but if a priest decided it wasn't clean enough, you would have to take it out there and swap it with someone who had a clean animal. And tradition seems to tell us that then they would put that animal at the back of the line and sell it to somebody later. There were obviously areas for poor people to buy things like doves, because that was the poor man's offering, people who couldn't afford a lamb or a ram or something like that. So all of this business, all of this money and exchanging and animal action is happening in the Gentile courts. That's the outer court area where non-Jewish people were to be able to come to the temple in order to pray. That's why Jesus says it's going to be a temple of prayer, a house of prayer for all the nations. There was a place even for non-Jewish people to come and pray, but that space has now been taken up by all of this, I think, is necessary business, but obviously it had become a little too much. So Jesus would have seen all that. He would have seen this large, impressive building, this massive facility that is the central figure of all of Judaism. It's the central figure even in Jerusalem. Like, it is the thing that you see as you come into town. It's the thing that dominates the skyline everywhere you look. And some people thought that Judaism, the faith, couldn't exist without the presence of the temple, and obviously the city of Jerusalem would not be, and now is not, the same without the temple there. So Jesus would have seen this temple that looks like it's thriving. The same thing we would pick up like in verse 12, where he sees the fig tree. If you look at it, it says the next day they're leaving. Jesus is hungry. Seeing in the distance a fig tree and leaf, he went out to find it if it had any fruit. And when he reached it, he found nothing but leaves, because it was not the season for figs. So again, what would Jesus have seen here? He sees a fig tree on the outskirts of town. This gold and marble temple of the greatness of Jerusalem, and the temple is looming in the background. It's huge. It's a great backdrop, for pictures and stuff. And this fig tree looks healthy. It's got leaves on it. It's green. Everything looks right, except that there's no fruit there. Now, Mark makes the point to tell us like there wasn't supposed to be fruit there, because it wasn't the season for figs. And that's a clue for us. All right? Jesus is obviously fixing to curse this fig tree for not having fruit when it wasn't supposed to have fruit. And that gives us a clue that being out of season, maybe this whole episode, this whole cursing process is pointing to something else. So see on the first picture, like this first look, that everything appears to be thriving. You've got this massive, glorious temple building, outlandishly ravished in gold, and it's busy, and there's lots of money being made inside. There are people everywhere. It's glorious. It's exciting. It's the center of everything that is Jerusalem. And then you've got this fig tree that looks healthy. It's grown. It's got leafy green leaves. Everything looks right. Everything appears to be thriving. But they're not. Think about this fig tree. If you were to pick up like at the end of, say, verse 13, it says it wasn't the season for figs, so there's no figs on it. Verse 14, then he said to the tree, may no one ever bear, or no one ever eat fruit from you again. And his disciples heard it. So Jesus sees this fig tree. It's obviously not producing fruit, and he's going to curse it. And we got to think about then how obviously this fig tree is symbolic of something else. It's symbolic of the temple. And I think that's why Mark puts these stories together, and why it gives us the idea that there's more going on than Jesus just cleansing out the money changers. And this fig tree is symbolic of the fact that the temple is barren. Judaism is barren. The faith that revolved around the temple and is supposed to be happening in the temple isn't bearing fruit. It's not doing what it was supposed to. It's not pointing people to the Messiah. It wasn't preparing people for the Messiah. It's actually actively working against the manifestation and the revelation of the Messiah. Something's wrong. So Jesus looks at this poor fig tree and its symbolic nature, and he curses it. He says, may no one ever eat fruit from you again, which is deeply meaningful and powerful and problematic if we see that as symbolic of the Judaism that's present and not bearing fruit in Jerusalem. Now it says that the disciples heard him. And you kind of get the idea from the way Mark writes this, that it wasn't just that they heard what he says, they understood what he said. They were catching what it is that he did, and that he curses this fig tree as symbolic of something bigger. And then the great irony of this is, according to Mark, like in the timeline that Mark gives us, this is Jesus' last miracle. All right, keep reading through Mark. Jesus doesn't perform another miracle. No more healing, no raising from the dead, not even any more cursing. This is the last thing that he does as part of his physical earthly ministry in a supernatural sort of way, is he curses a fig tree as symbolic of the larger faith community that he is trying to salvage or rename or repurpose. Or what an interesting last miracle for him to perform. So this fig tree is not thriving, obviously symbolic of something else, and neither is the temple. All right, so the temple looks like it's thriving, but it's not. So back to verse 15. On reaching Jerusalem, Jesus, he enters the temple courts and began driving out those who were buying and selling there. I get the sense that like this was like immediate. Like he knew what he was doing. He had thought about this the night before. He overturned the tables of the money changers and the benches of those selling doves, and would not allow anyone to carry merchandise through the temple courts. So he sees this temple that is what's happening in it is the perversion of something holy. What is supposed to be a place for non-Jewish people, for Gentiles like you and me, to go, to worship, to pray, to connect to the one who created them and who's calling them to be part of his people. That place had become this economic nightmare. And there's this abundance of sin and greed that is there, and it's a perversion. The holy place that is supposed to be that outer court has now been perverted. And I see this even more deeply, that what was necessary business, because exchanges had to happen. Some people didn't have animals to sacrifice. They needed to buy an animal. Some people didn't have the right shekel. They needed to change it out and get the right. Some of this stuff had to happen. It was necessary business for the temple, but it wasn't primary business. And it seems from the way Jesus treats this and everything we know about the temple in that time, what was necessary had become primary. It's like in our churches. Yeah, we got to handle money. Yes, we have to do structures. Yes, there are things that we have to do in order to function as a community and as an organization. They're necessary, but they're never primary. And Jesus points that out in the temple, that this thing had become more than it was ever supposed to be. And what we see, what he's dealing with here, is that this sin that was present, this greed, this corruption that was so present in the temple, was so prevalent. And it had become so common that the people didn't even notice it. Like, they didn't see it. They just accepted that as the norm. This is the way things are. When you go to church, there's people out there changing all this stuff. And yeah, well, if the Gentiles don't get to pray, we don't really care. They're not one of us anyway. And it was just normal. The Pharisees didn't really pay any attention. The priests didn't pay any attention. The people didn't pay any attention to it. That sinful corruption had become so common that it felt like normal church for them. And we got to ask the question, and I want you to ask this question, all right, about whether or not this story, and obviously the temple, could be a metaphor for us. Because we think we're good, right? Like, we think we're good, righteous, and thriving people. We look good at our church. Like, we look good on the outside. Our building is in great shape. We're in good financial shape right now, ironically. Like, everything's looking good. But are we accomplishing our mission? Are we bearing fruit? Or have we allowed necessary things to become primary things and therefore forgotten the primary mission of calling these Gentiles to prayer and to right relationship with God? I would challenge you to think that maybe there is sin present underneath this pretty facade, and that this story of cleansing the temple hits us right in the gut, and we should hear it and pay attention to it. So look at what happens in the rest of the story. Like, we see there's this appearance of thriving, but there's actually not any thriving happening, and then there's destruction that follows it. Jump down to look at what Jesus says in verse 15, obviously talking about the temple. Reaching Jerusalem, he enters the temple courts, began driving out those who were buying and selling. He overturned the tables of the money changers, the benches of those selling doves, and would not allow anyone to carry merchandise to the temple courts. And he taught them, "Is it not written, my house will be called a house of prayer for all nations, but you have made it a den of robbers." Jesus confronts and destroys the perversion that is present in the temple. He tosses it symbolically. I mean, the next day these tables are back, right? The money changers are back. He didn't actually accomplish anything here. I think it's symbolic. I think he's tossing it to say, look, this is going to go. This is not the way things are going to be. Eventually this is going to be destroyed. As a matter of fact, in John's gospel, who puts this at the beginning, it's in John chapter 2, is where Jesus talks about, if you tear down this temple, I could rebuild it in 3 days. And obviously he's talking about himself, but what's the difference? We think about Jesus as the way to connect with God, and the temple was the way to connect with God. There's an interconnection here. Jesus goes and he kind of foresees and he prophesies. He points out the idea of the destruction of the temple and this way of doing it. And the same is true for the fig tree. At the end of the story, we catch back up on the fig tree. Jesus and the disciples have gone back to Bethany. They're now leaving Bethany. Seems like I think they're coming back into town again. And the disciples see the fig tree. In verse 20, in the morning as they went along, they saw the fig tree withered from the roots. Peter remembered and said to Jesus, Rabbi, look, the fig tree you cursed has withered. Now this tree withered overnight. You cut down a tree and it's not going to be withered overnight. And Jesus is able to do that with his voice. And so there's obviously this miracle that's happened here. This tree has died. It's supposed to be symbolic of the temple. The idea that the temple is not going to be needed anymore. It's going to be destroyed. Just as anything that doesn't bear fruit will be destroyed. And I want us to think that like this becomes something for us to think about, to chew on, and to listen to very closely. Because somebody just came in a minute ago. You may have noticed the cut coming into the destruction section. So we just stopped and talked for a minute and recognized that this week makes 2 months since we've been able to have church together, be able to do what it is we normally do together. And, man, it's been terrible, right? Like this pandemic, the sickness that is involved, the 80,000 Americans that have died in 3 months, that's astronomical. The sickness of that, the economics of it, obviously our separation, it's terrible. It's a horrible thing. And I hope that we've taken at least advantage of the separation, advantage of being stuck at home, to take the chance to do some cleaning out and to take the things to the dumpsters and clean out your house. And I think that this pandemic also gives us as a church the opportunity to do some cleansing out too. To clean out our sins, to cleanse out our perversion of goodness, to cleanse out our lack of fruit bearing, and to get back on mission, to get back on point, to get back to who it is we're supposed to be as the place where others gather to connect with God, as the ones who draw other people to God. And I guess that's why God brought this story to me this week, is that I think it's time for us to do a little spring cleaning, a little cleaning house. And not just the sweeping and the mopping and the vacuuming kind, but the looking into our heart, our soul, and who we are and who we're supposed to be, recognizing the disparity between the two.